No, we are in Acts chapter 20, verses 1 through 12. Our missionary journey continues, part 7. Eutychus is raised from the dead. Acts 20, 1 through 12. And after the uproar was ceased, Paul called unto him the disciples and embraced them, and departed for to go into Macedonia. And when he had gone over those parts and had given them much exhortation, he came into Greece, and there abode 3 months. And when the Jews laid wait for him as he was about to sail into Syria, he purposed to return through Macedonia. And there accompanied him into Asia Sopater of Berea, and of the Thessalonians Aristarchus and Secundus, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timotheus, Timothy, and of Asia Eutychus, and Trophimus. These going before tarried for us at Troas. And we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and came to them to Troas in 5 days, where we abode 7 days. And on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul preached unto them, ready to depart on the morrow, and continued his speech until midnight. And there were many lights in the upper chamber where they were gathered together. And there sat in the window a certain young man named Eutychus, being fallen into a deep sleep. And as Paul was long preaching, he sunk down with sleep, and fell down from the 3rd loft, and was taken up dead. And Paul went down and fell on him, and embracing him said, Trouble not yourselves, for his life is in him. When he therefore was come up again, and had broken bread, and eaten and talked a long while, even till break of day, so he departed. And they brought the young man alive, and were not a little comforted. Our missionary journey, part 7, Eutychus is raised from the dead. We have 3 divisions. Number 1, churches are encouraged. Acts 20, verse 1 through verse 3, the first part. Number 2, a change of plans. Acts 20, verse 3, the second part through verse 6. And number 3, a compressed ministry in Troas, Acts 20, verses 7 through 12. A little bit of review. All here through our missionary journey has been in Ephesus. They had a riot brought about by Demetrius, a silversmith, and other craftsmen who were causing trouble because people were coming to the Lord and they didn't need the miniature shrines of the temple of Artemis, or the miniature replications of that probably meteor that fell from the sky that they worshipped as an image of Artemis. So Paul was forbidden to go into the assembly. It was an unlawful assembly. And the disciples, they wouldn't let him go. The Asiarchs, they sent word for him not to go, and he didn't. They seized 2 others, obviously believers, and they had them in front. So they cried out for 2 hours, Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. So the town clerk settled them down, warned them that they were in danger of action from Rome of being in an unlawful assembly, so he dismissed him and they went home. So I guess Paul kind of figured his ministry was over at Ephesus. He had a good one, but in all actuality, he had the desire. Acts 19:21, even before this, he had made up his mind. It was his purpose. He wanted to go into Macedonia and Achaia, and then to go to Jerusalem. It doesn't say in Acts Well, why he wanted to go to Jerusalem? Because a lot of these churches that Paul had founded, they were taking up offerings to give to the Jews in, not the Jews, but the Christians in Jerusalem at the church, because they had a famine, and many of them were poor and very needy. And then he had desire after that to go into Rome. So he's ready to leave Ephesus and do these things they wanted to do. Go to Macedonia, Achaia, Jerusalem, and to Rome. So on his journey, he goes through Macedonia, and there the churches are encouraged. Verse 1 through the first part of verse 3. And after the uproar, the riot is over, Paul called the disciples, that would be the church of believers at Ephesus. He called them together and had a farewell hug embrace. And he left them and went into Macedonia. Macedonia is where Thessalonica was and where Berea was, where he went on the second missionary journey. One writer wrote, probably Paul was in this trek, in this sideline, probably a year in this ministry. Now, Luke leaves some things out that we really get from other letters, and I'm really getting this to others, but A.T. Robertson, who is a Greek scholar, it doesn't mention that Paul ministered in Troas probably during this period, that is in 2 Corinthians 2:12 following, or how that he had Titus in Macedonia, that is 2 Corinthians 2:13 and following. By the way, Paul sent Titus to Corinth to help him with all the problems they were having in the church. Paul made a visit to Illyricum, which is in Romans 15:15, that he probably did during this period. But went into Macedonia, no doubt the churches that he had established. And verse 2, he gave them much exhortation or encouragement. And then he went into Greece, or that's another word for Achaia. And Achaia was where Corinth was. And he was in Greece or Achaia for 3 months. And we believe that probably during the 3 months, most of the time he spent in Corinth. We know he visited them again. And we believe that in Corinth, Paul wrote the letter to the Romans. It is very possible that there in Corinth that he wrote the letter to the Galatians. But as was a quite common practice for Paul, he would go and visit the churches that he had preached and established, and encouraging them, answering questions, probably even ordaining elders. But he did that quite often. Secondly, we see a change of plans. Acts 20, verse 3b through 6. Because Paul found that his life was in danger. Verse 3, when the Jews laid wait for him as he was about to sail to Syria, he purposed to return through Macedonia. Paul originally had the desire, he wanted to make it to Jerusalem to observe Passover. And a lot of the Jews who lived outside of the Holy Land, they would sail into Syria, which is north of the Holy Land, and then they would go south to Jerusalem and worship Passover or Pentecost or the Feast of Tabernacles, the 3 main feasts that Jewish men were supposed to go to if they could. That was Paul's intention. But he learned of a plot. The Jews found out where he was, obviously unbelieving Jews, and they knew that he had planned to go into Syria by boat. And there were several opportunities there at the harbor entering the boat. He would be in danger. You got Jews going to Jerusalem anyway, so they could kill him on the boat, or they could just be out in the middle of the sea and throw him into the water. Boy, they hated Paul a lot. And you know the devil hates us a lot too, and would get rid of every one of us if God didn't protect us. So Paul found out about the plot, and he changed his plans. So he decided, I'm going to go back through Macedonia. That's where he just come from. So that means he's traveling by land rather than by sea, and that makes him late. So he probably misses Passover and decides later to make it for Pentecost, which I believe he will. Verse 4, they're coming to him into Asia. By the way, the better manuscripts that I have into Asia, we have these individuals. Sopater of Berea, he's mentioned one other time with a longer version of his name, Sopater. And of the Thessalonians, Aristarchus and Secundus. Aristarchus is mentioned, I believe, 4 other times in the New Testament. He is one of the 2 men when they had the riot in Ephesus. He and a man named Gaius, they were 2 who ceased because they couldn't find Paul. And Gaius of Derbe, you have, I believe, 4 different individuals in the New Testament by the name of Gaius, and they're probably every one of them different men. And then you have Timothy, of course. He was from, I believe, Lystra, and he was the one who got the letters, 1st, 2nd Timothy. He was, as Paul called him, he is my son in the faith. He's my preacher boy. He loved Timothy very much, and Timothy was a very good help to him. And of Asia, Eutychus and Trophimus. There, I believe you have 7 individuals. These are probably those who are chosen by the churches who are to carry the gifts by the churches to the poor saints in Jerusalem. So that way, Paul doesn't have to handle the money, and no chance for anyone to accuse him of stealing. So verse 5, these going before tarried for us at Troas. They went ahead, and Paul came later. Now notice in verse 5, for us. So here now we begin another wee passage in Luke. Luke, I believe, was left behind in Philippi when Paul moved on. And now they go back to Philippi, verse 6, and now we have a wee passage. Now Luke once again joins Paul. So the group, they went ahead to Troas, and Luke, verse 6, and we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread. So they missed Passover in Jerusalem. You have Passover, and then following that you have the week of unleavened bread, where they eat bread that has no yeast or any other leavening agent, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And so they probably observed that week in Philippi, and after that, they went to Troas in 5 days, where we abode for 7 days. So I went from Philippi, a seaport to Troas. It took them 5 days. Earlier, I believe, on another journey, I don't know if it was this one or the second, they went the other direction from Troas to Philippi, and they made that trip in 2 days. The other direction took them 5 days. Probably because of the winds were contrary to them, maybe even currents. They got to Troas, and they were only there for 7 days. By the way, Paul, in visiting the churches in Macedonia and Achaia, or at least Macedonia, probably never visited him again. And Troas, probably he never visited that church again. He's there for 7 days, and at the end of the 7th day, they all meet together. So he has hardly a compressed ministry in Troas, only 7 days, and on the last of the day, the church, they gather together, and Paul speaks. So, verse 7, on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread. So here we have a precedent of the early believers having their worship on the first day of the week, the Lord's Day, Sunday, the day that Jesus rose from the dead. The Jews, their holy day is Saturday, the Sabbath, the 7th day. Christians, we honor the first day of the week when Jesus rose from the dead, Sunday, the Lord's Day. It seems even by now that that is a practice. So there was the first day of the week. Probably they met in the evening. Why they do that? Because Sunday wasn't an off day in the Roman Empire those days. It was a regular work day. So those who had day jobs, they had to work. Those who were slaves, we believe there were slaves that were in that congregation. Those who were slaves, they had to fulfill all their duties during the day. And then they could meet in the evenings, probably when they did. So they came together to break bread, and that probably refers to the Lord's Supper. And Paul preached on them. The word actually is a word where we get dialogue from. So he discoursed with them, so probably they had two-way conversations. But Paul spoke unto them, knowing that tomorrow, on the next day, he was planning to leave, and so he spoke until midnight. You think I'm a long-winded preacher? He went from evening till midnight. I always think of Jim Steele, who would say, a short sermon is a good sermon. But Paul went until midnight. So verse 8, and there were many lights in the upper chamber where they were gathered together. In those days, oftentimes on the upper chamber, many times on the 3rd floor, they would have an area where you would have a large room suitable for gatherings. So remember, in the early days, they didn't have church buildings. They met in homes. So anybody who was well-to-do and had a big house, they met. The disciples in the early part of Acts, they met in the home of John Mark's mother, in her house. When Peter was in prison, they were praying for him, and he was let loose. He went to John Mark's mother's house. So there they were, and there were many lights in the upper chamber. The lights, because of the closeness to Pentecost, or that is after Passover. Passover is a full moon, and this is several days after that, so it's probably dark. He's already gone to midnight, and you have lights, rather the word is lamps. It could be either torches or lamps that burn from oil. And so that would make that upper room very smoky and very warm. So verse 9, there was a young man named Eutychus, and he was sitting at the window. So it wasn't covered. It probably, you might say, he was sitting on the windowsill on the very edge. And he was doing this number. He was trying to stay awake, and he struggled and finally got the best of it. and he went to deep sleep, and when he did, he tumbled out the window and fell 3 stories. So Paul went down, and by the way, it says, verse 9, last part, and he was taken up dead. Remember, this is written by Luke, a physician. He was dead. And no doubt the people considered him dead. And later on, you'll have a phrase that says that he is living. If he just fell and was knocked out, you would say that he was dead and that they were rejoicing that he was living. So I believe he really died. He's taken up dead. Paul went down and fell on him and embracing him. This is very similar to what Elijah and Elisha did in the Old Testament when both of them raised sons from the dead. They got on top of that boy, and that's what Paul did. And Paul said, hey, quit troubling yourselves, for his life is in him. And I'm going to take the view that Paul has already done what he's going to do, and the Spirit has moved him, and that he's already raised from the dead. Where he had been lifeless, motionless, no breath, no heartbeat. Paul goes down there, and God uses him, and he's raised from him. Hey, he's all right. Don't be disturbed anymore. His life is in him. Actually, it's the word for soul. His soul is in him, suke. So verse 11, Paul got up, went back up to the 3rd floor, and he had broken bread and eaten, so probably they observed the Lord's Supper, and then they ate. In the early days of the church is, when they had the Lord's Supper, they would have an agape, the Greek word for love, and we call it a love feast. So they would have a fellowship meal almost every time they had the Lord's Supper. And this is probably what they did, Lord's Supper and a meal. And so Paul eats, I guess, a little break. Perhaps they all eat. And then he talks again, and he goes all the way until daybreak, until dawn. So he spoke from evening until midnight. And sometimes the boy falls, young man falls, and dies, raised from the dead, and then have a break of eating, and then he speaks again and goes until daybreak. But you got to remember that this is probably the last time that he visits him. He probably is aware of that. And by the way, even though later on it'll be mentioned, probably Paul may have already been getting indications from the Holy Spirit that when he gets to Jerusalem, he's going to face difficulty and be arrested. So he knows he's not going to be with them probably ever again, and that's why he speaks all night long. So after he's over, he leaves, probably never again returns. So verse 12, and they brought the young man alive and were not a little comforted. Luke does this quite often. He writes, instead of saying they were comforted a whole lot, he says they were comforted not a little. I don't know why, but Luke uses that kind of writing quite often in the book of Acts. So, man, they were happy. This man, a young man, he fell, died, and was raised from the dead. And they rejoiced because of that. 3 applications. Number 1, encourage other believers. Yeah, that's what Paul did. He encouraged other believers. One time he mentions that he has the burden of the care of the churches that are upon him. All these churches that he's established, some of them struggle. Some of them have false teachers that come in behind him. The churches in the Galatian areas, you got the Judaizers that come in and say that faith in Jesus is not enough. You also have to obey the law. And so Paul had these burdens. So every chance he got to revisit a church, encourage them and help them with their problems, he did. And we need to encourage each other because we all have problems. And sometimes we don't share them with other people. But we all have problems. We all have those down days, and we need to encourage one another. That's what Paul did. Number 2, have fellowship with believers in church and outside church. In those days, they met in homes. They had church buildings till later. But they met together and they had fellowship. And it's good to be with God's people and have fellowship both in church settings and also in other settings. Number 3, minister. That's what Paul did. That's what his fellow laborers did. Minister, they evangelized, they shared the gospel. They used their spiritual gifts. And that's what we need to do. Every one of us who are born again, we are a missionary. We are missionaries. Where you live, where you work, your family, your context, you are a missionary in that field. We need to minister in that field. So I have added 2 bonus applications that will be up here on the board. Number 4, learn to adapt. Paul, he wanted to go to Jerusalem for Passover, and he couldn't make it because the Jews are trying to kill him. So instead of taking a ship and get there quickly, he had to go by land and be delayed. But he adapted. And we make plans, we want to do this, we want to do that for the Lord, and a monkey wrench gets thrown in and we can't do it, and I want to do this. And learn to adapt. God closed that door, but maybe he'll open another door. And number 5, God's power. God used Paul to raise Eutychus from the dead. Very rarely. We have a record of Jesus doing it 3 times. I think he did it a lot more. Peter did it once. Paul did it once. Elijah and Elisha did it once. And I believe it was Elisha's bones. I didn't end up his bones, and he was raised from the dead. Of course, Jesus rose from the dead. Other than that, and there were some saints that rose from the dead, but for people to raise, God used first to raise someone from the dead. Very, very rare. I know that movie, Faith Like Potatoes. I believe the guy was in South Africa. A woman was struck by lightning, and I believe God used him to raise that lady from the dead. But it doesn't happen very often. But God, the God we serve, is powerful. He can do anything. He can meet all of our needs. He can help us through our rough times, and may we trust him and him to do that. And again, if you're here and you see this on YouTube or Facebook, and you don't know Jesus is Lord, and do not let this day pass before you. Confess that you're a sinner to God. You ask Jesus to forgive your sins, and you commit to Jesus as Lord and get the gift of eternal life. May God bless his word. And Sean, would you lead us in prayer?